Coming up, with the impending return and ultimately debut of TJ Warren for the Brooklyn Nets, we ask the question, how much stock should Brooklyn Nets fans be putting into a player that hasn't seen the court in 2 years? On top of which, as we've just passed that 27.5% point of the season, is Sean Marks really the man we want at the helm, making key decisions potentially as rumors circulate of players the Nets might acquire? We break it all down next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there is at Doug Norrie on Twitter. Over here is at Adam Armbrecht, also on Twitter. And you can go ahead and be sure to know, gosh, this is going to be a rough one, Doug, that we are thankful you make us your first listen of the day free on all those great platforms. We're going to get into TJ Warren. We're going to get into Sean Marks. We're going to get into what's happened to me over the past couple of episodes, seemingly losing my ability to speak.
Well, last night you forgot your name. tonight it's getting through. We're already two cold opens into this bad boy. And now we're just plowing through. But that's fine. Just like the Nets are going to plow through the rest of the season, you are continuing to just plow through. Mistakes doesn't matter. Bad decisions doesn't matter. Missteps doesn't matter. We're still going.
And so ultimately, where we're going to kick things off, as at the top, was TJ Warren. We mentioned this the last couple of episodes. There's a few things here. We talked about Yuta Watanabe. They're going to reevaluate him next week. Ben Simmons goes down. That could be a trend for him for this season as well, coming off of his own issues, obviously, from an injury standpoint. TJ Warren, it seems like the fan base is very excited about him. I was surprised last episode, though, when this name came up. You've typically been saying, don't even bring his name up because there's no reason to consider him until you even see what he's capable of with all the time he's been away. And yet last episode, you seem to kind of frame it in a way that sounded like a little bit of TJ Warren might be just what the doctor ordered for this team.
Well, that might be where the Nets have just gotten me, because that might be more about the Nets situation than it is about overwhelming positivity. I'm not trying to be like a negative Nelly, as all the kids are saying these days, about the situation, as TJ Warren famously liked the tweet that I had said where I didn't expect much from him. So I'm sure he's put that up on the bulletin board at some point. Just getting my head, through the just I like to think that like I'm part of the reason that he's making a return here. Mm-hmm. But it's not so much that I have like this overwhelmingly positive feeling like this is going to be a season saver. But I will say two things. One, just because it's the Nets, I had sort of become increasingly pessimistic about him coming back at all, right? Just so the fact that he's not on the injury report and he's just cleared to play, I kind of just didn't think that was going to happen. We have too many examples with the Nets over the years where injury timelines are so much longer than they originally lay out, right? And sometimes guys a la Ben Simmons and other examples, they just don't come back, right? Mm-hmm. Like the timeline just runs out and they don't end up ever coming back. So I think part of my positivity was just around, hey, it's happening. That's great. That's great news.
It's come to pass.
It's negative only because I don't want to let what I don't think is the right thing to do, which is what fans I think sometimes do, is TJ Warren's going to save the season. Like, I don't think that is the mindset, because there's a long way to fall from that mindset. Mm-hmm. But being cautiously optimistic around a guy whose skill set they could desperately use on this team, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why. I think that is the part where I was kind of like, okay, I'm here for it. This should be great, because 75% of what TJ Warren was before he got hurt would be 100% of what the Nets need right this very minute, with how much is on Durant's shoulders, how much is on Kyrie's shoulders with scoring. No Ben Simmons, right? No Yuta Watanabe right now, who's become a key contributor. Like, they need another guy here. Yep. And so I think that's where the optimism came from.
Yeah, and you go back and you look at it, it's funny, because, all but 4 games in the 2020-2021 season there for the Pacers. But even going back to when he was with the Phoenix Suns there, he's 19, 18, 19. Like, he's a borderline 20-point scorer, always been a double-digit scorer for the majority of his career. Has had 3-4 seasons where he knocked down upwards of 35 to 40% from beyond the arc. And at 6'8", you mentioned Yuta Watanabe. These guys aren't carbon copies of each other by any extent.
No.
But just having that little bit of extra size that plugs into in positionless basketball, the three, it just kind of keeps a level of consistency from one unit to the next and the guys you want to surround Kevin Durant with. That's where I think it matters. And it's interesting too, because I don't want to put high expectations on TJ Warren walking out there. But in the world where you said 75%, all right, if you can be a 14, 15 point a night kind of guy for the Brooklyn Nets, it does dramatically kind of change the way you think about what the rotations look like. And dovetailing off of these last couple of games, we've been so happy and excited watching Kevin Durant do his thing. If you want to be able to bring down his minutes and his workload over the course of this season, a guy like TJ Warren is actually a player that can do that, because I thought about this in comparison to a couple other guys, and they're, again, not one-to-one, but it's supporting scorers. So that's Seth Curry, it's Joe Harris, and then we'll put TJ Warren into that group. And the big difference is TJ Warren has, in theory, haven't seen him in 2 years, more athleticism and more scoring ability than a Joe Harris.
Oh, yeah.
And he has way more size than a Seth Curry, right? So it's that nice little combination. He's not the perfect player, but a more athletic and bigger version between those other two players is it's just kind of what we've gotten out of Yuta Watanabe in a lot of ways, just able to do enough in enough key areas. And this would mark a nice addition to this roster. You just preferred, I think, to me, whatever he's going to be, I would have preferred that he had been in camp and able to play, so we had a sense of where this was going, not kind of coming in blind 20 plus games into the year.
Yeah, I do think there's going to be a ramp up process for sure. We'll see how much he even, if he even plays at all. Like, he is off the injury report, but we don't know what that means. I would be shocked if he played more than 10 minutes. Like, this is a long time. It's December 26th, I believe, of 2021. December
It's like 4 games in, so that you're talking October, beginning of November.
December 29th, 2020 was the last time he stepped on the basketball court.
Oh, right. Because sorry.
And so, because it was because they delayed the season in 2020 because of the bubble, of which in the bubble, he was like an absolute god. He took over some games. I mean, that was a totally different sort of scenario, but you got glimpses, and that was actually on an interesting stage because those games were pretty high profile at the time because they were sports coming back, right? The bubble took on a somewhat different significance at the time. He basically became a different player when he went to Indiana. Like, so Phoenix essentially gave him away. He in his last season, he was shot 43% from three. And then he became a different player in his last season with the Suns. Then they gave him away and he went to Indiana and continued to be the same guy, like 40% at some volume from three, 15 shots a game, like can create his own shot. You said about the size, and he's pretty thick too. Not a phenomenal defender, but I don't think that really matters for the Nets at this point. They just need a guy who can create his own shot off the dribble, late in shot clock guys. They don't have these guys really. Like Seth Curry, as you mentioned, you're not wrong. You don't think of Seth Curry as this like on-ball scorer at all. And different iterations of him, like on Dallas and even with Philly, was not this. But the Nets have needed him to be this way because they just are devoid of really any other guy outside of KD and Kyrie who can do it. So at that point, you are seeing guys like Curry, guys like Harris try to get into the lane a little bit more. When they have closeouts that come a little too quick, they will put it down and try to get into the lane a little bit for the mid range. Curry does it significantly more than Harris does. But all that stuff is like stuff Warren, the older version of him, could do way better than anybody else except for Durant and Durant and Irving on the team. So.
And you can even throw Royce O'Neal just into that bag of guys being asked to do more than was expected coming into the season, and how this could alleviate it from an offensive end. For sure.
Like, these guys are doing way more offensively than anyone ever really imagined, because really what people imagined was Simmons kind of controlling some of the offense, Kyrie and KD getting into like, two-man game kind of stuff in the mid-range and getting into the lane, and everyone else just literally standing around the three-point line and shooting. Like that was pretty much, or, Claxton in the dunker spot, and, you work some two-man stuff off him. That's pretty much what everyone imagined this team was going to be predicated on. But because of all the stuff that's going on, Kyrie missing time, Simmons missing time, KD just not being able to do every single thing, right? Because he really shouldn't have to be. All these guys are asked to be doing more than really they've ever had to do at other points in their career. It's amazing that it's kind of worked out-ish with some of these guys. adding Warren, adding 16 minutes a game from a guy like TJ Warren would be a pretty huge upgrade for the team if he was, like I said, 75% of what he was before. We're not asking for full bubble TJ Warren to walk back through the door. I don't think that's happening, but some other slightly lesser version of it, that would still be a major upgrade from what they have.
No, 100%. So coming up in a second, I want to take a look at how his potential arrival and insertion into this rotation can impact the ask of other players and how it can kind of maybe eliminate some of the questions we've had about who else is going to come off the bench to fill in some minutes. Maybe you need not ask that anymore. And then on the back end of this episode, this kind of extends into some rumors and speculation around maybe this team improving itself and whether or not TJ Warren, who was acquired by one Sean Marks, is necessarily the GM that should be making these decisions for the Nets.
Before we get to all that, going to tell you about our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get all the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. If you're into football, obviously that's coming on the weekends. Basketball every single night of the week. Soccer World Cup still raging on. Esports too. That's all there at betonline.net. It's the fastest and easiest way to get your betting fix. Head on over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. Bet online, where the game starts.
Okay, so before we get into the Sean Marks piece of this, because there was a little teasing our third segment, what I think we'll end up structuring this around a player and name that has been mentioned before, with every fan throwing out the big that they need, or now we've kind of talked about the backcourt needing some help as well. There's a player that has been the apple of my eye for a couple of seasons now, but should Sean Marks really be the guy to pull the trigger on that? We'll discuss that. But on TJ Warren specifically, and Ben Simmons and his injury, and maybe even Yuta Watanabe and his injury, we kind of alluded, how much expectation can we put on TJ Warren? But in effect, it's like, how much expectation can we put on Yuta Watanabe and on Ben Simmons? Like, we end up having a group of players, whether it's due to injury or raising their level of game in the case of Yuta, where now the optimism on this season becomes about guys that either haven't shown it in a long time or have never really done that thing. So it's the weird part where, like, I'm excited to see TJ Warren come back and get some version of him. And also, I feel like I could list 4 or 5 guys on the roster that I go, they could be total zeros in 6 weeks and we could be having a much different conversation.
Okay, so there's 2 separate conversations here, because and this I think is going to be the thing that happens from now till basically the end of the season, is there's regular season Brooklyn Nets and there's playoff championship Brooklyn Nets. And those conversations are 2 totally different things, right? And because everything's just different. Like the playoff version of the NBA is much, much different than the regular season. Now you have to get through the regular season alive and healthy to have it matter in the playoffs, but things shrink down so much when it comes to the playoffs that a lot of the guys you think are really important at the time don't become that important. So like, if we're just talking about the playoff Nets, the most important 3 guys that are playing are KD, Kyrie, and Ben Simmons. And then like a functional Joe Harris, and then a few other and Claxton and a few other role players. And that's it. Now that's playoffs. That's a long way away. What's happening now, I think it does make sense to put stock into some of these guys. 1, because you want to know if they're assets or not. 2, you want to know if some of these guys have anything like a future with the team in any iteration that the team's going to be. And 3, it's just fun to watch NBA basketball, like, every second or third night, and to see that your team made some nice moves with some guys you can get excited about. There's a reason Yuta Watanabe was like so far more popular than anyone ever thought he would be. But like, it's because it's exciting. I don't think anyone sees him as like a 4th star or anything, but when he's banking home threes and just flexing those arms, those arms of his.
It was flexing. He was flexing.
So I was trying to make sure that was the right word for it. Like, that is fun. And I think that version of thinking about the Nets is like a good practice to think about, because I think there are other things like the future of the team you mentioned before with Marks and stuff that probably need to be thrown into the consideration here, because there is some version where this team does look different, but some of these guys are still relevant.
And there was one other thing that I forgot that we wanted to touch on here, and this is where it ties in, because we've said about watching these big performances from Kevin Durant and maybe adjusting our expectations for this team. And if you put it into the category of, hey, competitive team, going to win a lot of games, going to make the playoffs, but let's go ahead and bring that championship bar down a notch. then all of a sudden it's like watching Kevin Durant with these guys. It's almost a thrill. Like it's a night to night, game to game, exciting watch. And it took you and me a little bit of time over the course of this season to come out of that malaise of, listen, it's not just enough to win a game. You have to win it in a way that I can think about you guys competing for a championship. Okay, take that off the table. And the reason why I think we do that is also because one of the other factors we've talked about is the other teams. Like when you look in the Eastern Conference, and you and I have discussed this off the podcast, when you look at the Milwaukee Bucks and you look at the Boston Celtics, and even though it may not be as deep as you thought it was going to be, or at least in this moment in the East, it's hard to squint, even in the best version of the Brooklyn Nets, and think that you're going to be high level competitive with those caliber of teams that when they shorten their rotations, gosh, are they lethal, as opposed to the Brooklyn Nets shortening theirs almost out of necessity. And I know
well,
that.
Can I say one thing about that? Because I actually think in this version of it that you just described, which is correct, this is actually worse for the Nets. So I think what we thought there was going to be this huge crowd of teams that was all going to look really good. Like there were some teams we weren't totally sure about. And there was going to be some other versions that we were going to have to try to guess at. But I think we thought it would be pretty crowded. What's actually turning out here is that it's crowded in the middle, but not at the top. Yep. Like the teams that are good now look really good. Like Boston looks so good, right? Milwaukee, who hasn't even had Middleton all season, looks really good. Cleveland, that experiment is working, and they've had a lot of injuries, and they look awesome. Like they've missed time with almost every key guy has missed some time. Like Darius missed time with a facial injury. Jared Allen sat out a bunch of games here. Like, and they're still 14-8. So, and that's just the East. So I think I hope I didn't just roll over your thought here, but like those three teams have kind of separated themselves. And I don't think, at least I personally didn't think that was going to happen in such a clear way. Look, the season's long, lots of stuff can happen, but is that like, I think that's actually more problematic for the Nets.
So I was going to say, so then do you mean that it's almost more problematic just from an outside looking in standpoint of like, hey, it's actually not as top heavy as we thought it was going to be. And you're not a team that you're automatically putting in the top heavy area. You're actually a part of the meaty part of this pack here. And when you look at those teams, the Pacers and in the state of the Philadelphia 76ers right now, the Hawks, the Raptors, the Nets, the Wizards, like it's all just kind of this hodgepodge. And you'd like to think
that's the middle, though,
rise to the top, but they're clearly not at that point yet.
Right. That's the middle group. The middle group is like, we're trying to make sense of it, right? I don't think anyone thinks that Indiana is going to stay at 12-9 here, or like, 3 games over 500 the whole season. The Sixers have had a massive amount of injuries, and they're still 2 games over 500, right? And so I think you can see those teams. You can see one of those teams dipping down. You can maybe see a team or two improve. It's hard to see the Nets improving tons, but what it's specifically hard to do, it's hard to see them catching that top group. Right. Yeah. Like, I think that's the problem. I think that's the problem the Nets have right now, is that it's hard for me to think about putting them in the Boston class right now, because Boston's just been steamrolling teams, and they don't even have Robert Williams. And like, whatever you think of him, he closed finals games last year. So he's and was a defensive player of the year candidate if he had stayed healthy the whole season. Like, he's awesome. And they haven't had him all season. And like we already said with Middleton, the Bucks aren't missing arguably their third best guy. And they've had no problems. And so it does. I think that's where you have to pump the brakes a little bit on the Nets and say, even at a fully healthy version, are like right now, if the playoffs started now, are they competing with those teams? It's really hard to see it. It's really, really difficult to see it that way. And I think that is what calls into question sort of the rest of the season, is there a version that can get to that point? Like, do they have a gear that they can get up to that point? Probably, but I don't say that with any real conviction, because those teams are like really complete teams.
Yeah.
Like, and especially playoff versions of them are really, really complete teams. Like, they have all of the necessary pieces to make long playoff runs, just because they kind of can do everything. And 2 of them have already proven it in the Celtics and the Bucks. So that's where I get a little worried about the Nets. And that's actually also why I would just kind of want to focus on the regular season, because I think that, like we said yesterday, is like, that's the version that we should probably hold really tight to right now.
Yeah, and just in thinking about it, it's like this thing can all play out where if you're in the muddled pack of these teams, how do those matchups potentially play themselves out? Where a team like the Brooklyn Nets might need a round to get their legs underneath them, but if you're not in that position to face one of the quote weaker teams, all of a sudden you're facing a stiffer challenge. But I think you framed it the right way too. That's for down the road. That's for the end of the season. Right now, it's just about figuring out if this team, as we said these last couple of games, the wins have been good, but can you do it against some of the upper echelon teams? Those tests haven't come yet, and they're still trying to figure out a lot. And in figuring out all of that, I do come back to that question. The demand posed by one Kevin Durant in the offseason was met halfway. Steve Nash is gone. Sean Marks remains. And coming up in a second, we'll debate whether or not that is a good thing, especially if this team does continue to gel and show some signs of life as we work our way towards the midway point of this season. Okay, so we did the 27.5% mark of the season, and we talked mostly about the team, the players, etc. And forgive me, someone brought this up in one of the YouTube comments on one of our videos, and I thought it was interesting. He wanted to go back and kind of relitigate where Sean Marks has been successful or not as a GM, and we've done a lot of that over the course of this show. But it did kind of spark a more interesting question for me, which was, okay, TJ Warren comes back and he looks like 75% of the player that we've seen before. And Yuta Watanabe gets mostly healthy and Ben Simmons kind of finds his legs. There has been the reemergence of this rumor of late when people talk about adding talent. A guy that seemingly is a little bit out of place now in Atlanta and has been for a couple of years is John Collins. And I only bring up because we don't talk about the speculative idea of trades. But when a name like that comes up and the idea of the Nets, it's been reported that the Nets have at least inquired. They've checked in about what that would look like potentially to pursue a trade with the Atlanta Hawks. Do you want Sean Marks executing that trade? Like, it really does then make this very interesting question of, if there are players available, if a John Collins gets on the market, would you rather the Nets say not touch it because Sean Marks is making the decision and we don't know if he'll be the GM next year? Or do you trust him to improve this team and try to make that little incremental push for them to be a team that is considered a top 5 or 6 in the East, as opposed to maybe muddling towards those play-in areas?
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is this is less a question about whether or not the team should try to trade for John Collins, but more about whether or not, like, Sean Marks should be facilitating the new versions of the team as the team goes forward, right?
Yeah.
Like, is he a lame duck GM? I don't think there's any real sign that that's the case. But I will say that when you are possibly GMing for your job as opposed to GMing for the growth of a team, those two things become extremely different, right? And it's very hard to push through moves with like a sound state of mind if you're GMing for your job, or if you're just GMing because you're going to be there for 10 years or something like, or think you're going to be there for 10 years. Those are two completely different practices. Again, there's no rumor that Sean Marks's job is unsafe here. I will say I'd be shocked if it wasn't, if this season ends up a disaster because, like, if they don't make the playoffs, let's say, or if it's another first round exit, frankly.
And if he executes a trade like this, then I think it elevates his job being on the line. If it's not, because it's okay, you went out, you made the move, you got maybe a high profile player. That means that you think this season can be successful to whatever version. Go back to media day, competing for championships. That's still the agenda for this organization. So if making a move at the deadline was in that vein, then all of a sudden it does become very results oriented. So yeah, there's no indication that it is on the line. In some ways, you'd almost think, okay, we agree, Kevin, Steve Nash was not the right guy, right? So we're moving on from him. But from Joe Tsai's perspective, I still believe in Sean Marks. The irony here is you go all the way back to the early days of Sean Marks. If this was 3 years ago, you go, oh my God, yeah, have this guy plucking the strings, man, working the phones. Now you look back over the last couple of instances, some by his choosing, some maybe where his hand has been forced. He hasn't exactly come out on the winning side of a lot of trades here. And it's why the future, if not including Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, all of a sudden is a little bit of a bleaker landscape for Nets fans. So, I mean, like, I feel confident in him. Like, I don't necessarily have the same high level of doubts around what he's done these last handful of years. But you know, I was more willing to give Steve Nash a little bit more leeway just because everything's been so chaotic. Maybe I give Sean Marks too much leeway around that, but I tend to think, Sean Marks didn't know that James Harden was going to say, I'm done here. Nor, and he didn't know that when he traded for him in the first place, that maybe him and Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving collectively were not going to be on the same page. So it's like,
well, you can't really hold on, because you can't really let him off the hook for not knowing. I mean, it's your job to know. Like it's your job.
Okay, sorry.
Like it's your. I know. I think I know what you're saying, but it is your job. It is your kind of your job to know that stuff. Like that's kind of the whole job.
Okay, let me frame it this way then, because I don't want to drag. I don't want to drag up this stuff. But I'll put it this way.
Well, no, you should do it because I have a comment that I'm going to say back to it. So you might as well.
When he made the trade for James Harden, I don't think that was predicated on the idea that he didn't like the roster that they had around Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. I think it was a sense of, I have real concerns. Remember, go back to that. I have real concerns around Kyrie Irving's availability and commitment to the team. I need to ensure that I'm going to keep Kevin Durant happy. Now, in theory, there was a point, and all this stuff is going to be left to speculation, when it was Kyrie Irving and James Harden are not operating on the same page. And it seems like, at least from my perspective, was, Kevin, who do you want to keep? And he went with Kyrie Irving. And I'm not going to fault him for that. But now all of a sudden, as a GM, you go, okay, the guy that I went out as the safeguard for one of our other players is now the guy you don't want. What am I supposed to do? Now I have to figure this out. Again, maybe you should never make the trade in the first place. We've said 1,000 times out of 1,000 you do it. We know what that team looked like very briefly. But it's hard for me to look at a GM and say you're responsible for predicting what could come down the pike when we think about the personalities that have been on this team.
Okay, so I agree with you on most of those levels. I will say for Marks, yes, you're correct. You can't know you don't know exactly what it's going to look like when everyone's in the building. You take your best guess and you go for it, right? So I'm not going to harm him or not going to necessarily check him off for that. But I will say the problem with Marks keeping him in the job now, or if going forward, let's say if there's another first round exit or something like that, or just whatever, is that unfortunately for him, he has done a lot of little things right. He did almost all the little things right forever. The problem is the big stuff has been almost all wrong. Yeah. And it's not just one version of it, right? Like the big stuff has been it's gone spectacularly wrong for him on the biggest stuff. And that is where sometimes the buck just has to stop somewhere. So, right, like the Harden trade, we agreed with it, but it still didn't go right. They didn't re-sign him, and then they traded him for Ben Simmons, who
you can make the case that
has barely played. It does not seem like they had a full idea of what the medicals were when he came in. Like they clearly didn't, because they kept saying he was going to come back and play, and he never did. So
and that's 1,000% at Sean Marks' feet, including maybe not pushing for other players in that package, not named Ben Simmons.
Right. So they could have it just didn't work out. Like I know why they did it. I know why it's okay. This is what it is. I know why they traded for Harden, and I agreed with it, and it didn't work out. I understand why they traded him the next time for Simmons, and mostly agreed with it at the time, and it's not working out. Right. Right. Like I know why they signed Kyrie at the time and agreed with it. It hasn't really worked out. Yeah. Right. And so these things, you can even just agree with it at the time. None of those things have really worked out. Yeah. It's all for totally different reasons. It's all, hired Steve Nash. It didn't work out. Right. And so I got why they did it at the time. It didn't work. So each one of those things, the four most high profile things he's done, each one, right when they did it, I know for a fact we were on board with it. Right. So I'm like the king of not being results oriented. Right. Like I really am never. I really don't want to be results oriented, because for a big part of what I do off this is if you are that way, it's not going to pay. You can go back and evaluate where it went wrong or your process and stuff like that. But basing it strictly on the results is a mistake. In this case, it could just be a feature, not a bug. Like the four biggest things he's done outside of Durant, the Durant one worked. But then it kind of didn't, because he asked for a trade. Right. So, So even that one, you can put a negative in the column, because even though, again, a million times out of a million, you signed Durant. Actually, I'm not even saying about that, but it's you didn't do enough to keep him happy the whole time, because he asked for a trade. And so it's just been all the highest profile stuff has gone wrong for him. And at some point, it's just on you. I don't know.
It's been wrong. And it's funny too, because you're right. In all those instances, And same thing, even Steve Nash, right? Because it was Kenny Atkinson. Well, Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant didn't want Kenny Atkinson as a head coach. Okay, fine. Right. And I wasn't going to sit there.
And DeAndre Jordan too.
Right. Oh, and by the way, it's like, and the problem with this is, and not even a problem, but I think you're right that, okay, they wanted DeAndre Jordan to get paid. Okay. Now, in theory, we've talked about you do what makes the players happy, but sometimes you have to find a way to make them happy that also doesn't involve making a really bad decision, like giving DeAndre Jordan that money.
And by the way, add it to the list. I get why they did it at the time.
Right.
It didn't work out.
And I was going to say, firing Kenny Atkinson, I get why you did at the time. The mistake was hire someone else not named Steve Nash, right? So it's like you can make the right first step of the decision, but if the second step doesn't pan out, it ends up making everything look bad. So it is interesting. And by the way, we could probably sit here and talk about, in different ways, maybe at Joe Tsai level, at Kevin Durant level, at Kyrie Irving level, and label about what things went well or not. But from a Sean Marks perspective, I was always willing to give him all the accolades, always willing to say, this is a guy that's done such an excellent job. But hey, finding Joe Harris on the scrap heap of Cleveland, absolutely excellent. Great. Maybe paying him close to $20 million is going to look like it doesn't pan out. Like, so all these things do live in a very weird world where once upon a time, the Nets beat the Milwaukee Bucks, they advance out of the round, and all of a sudden everything looks a little bit different. But guess what? This isn't that version of it. And that's why, to circle it back to, when a player is going to maybe become available, when there's a decision to make around where the team is and whether or not Kyrie Irving should stay here for the rest of the year or be moved on from, whether or not you should blow it up or keep it together, it is this very tenuous premise of saying Sean Marks is going to steer that ship. That gives you both in one part of my mind, gives me a lot of confidence. But in the other half, I go, oh, this could be an absolute nightmare.
Well,
and
how after reading off
sits on that?
How after reading off that list can you feel confident? This is the problem. Like this is where it's very hard to feel confident, right? It's like because
okay, well, here's what I'll say. Ready? Here's what I would say is that if I go by the most recent events, you could say it's been terrible. Now, the most high profile thing of getting Kevin Durant works. You just screw up keeping him happy. Okay, fine. But in the world where it all goes belly up, I can go back to the time when the team didn't have any stars and Sean Marks did the process of building them up. Now, that isn't the most successful version of the franchise that we've all dreamed on. And maybe, you know what? Maybe the bottom line is too, I'll go to your side of it. Maybe a lot of GMs could have accomplished what he accomplished before they got the superstars. And maybe what matters most, I'll even say it, what does matter most is once you get to the point where you can attract the superstars, what do you do from there? And his track record from that point on has been a bit of a disaster.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because in the end, like the whole goal is to attract superstars or to get them through the draft. Now that's not going to be possible for the Nets going forward here. So like at some point, it's not, look, if I had to give Marks a grade, I would just give him like a C+ or a B-. I think mostly because I'm saying all the moves he made, I agreed with at the time and I got it. Right. And I for personally will just raise your grade higher because I can think rationally about this. Other people cannot. I know you can, but there's a lot of people out there cannot. They can see, did the ball go through the hoop the last time? That's how I'm going to evaluate if the guy's good or not. Like that's people's process. Because we agreed with those moves, I'm just saying at some point though, this many things go wrong. Like you just lose your job. Like
you draft a franchise quarterback that everyone agrees is going to be a stud in the NFL, and he turns out to be a bust. It was your fault, right?
Yeah, if I make 1,000 bets and the process was great every time, and then I'm down $10,000, it's like hard to go back to my wife and be like, "You should have seen the sick process, though, right?" Like, when you're down, when you're stuck 100K, it's like, oh yeah, the process, the process doesn't matter. My closing line value, I can't like take it to the grocery store. So so at some point, it just like doesn't matter if the process was correct or not. Like if you're stuck, you're stuck, and I think that's kind of where I'm landed on it.
All that to say, TJ Warren is going to come back maybe potentially on Friday night against the Toronto Raptors. Yuta Watanabe will heal and Ben Simmons will see what happens. But I do think, especially at this point of the season, we did it about the players. It's important to do it at the highest possible level because there's going to be moments, maybe coming sooner than we anticipate, where big decisions are going to have to get made. And maybe we'll find ourselves 30 games from now, 40 games from now, talking about how Sean Marks made a decision and it did work out. Or recent track record suggests maybe even with the best intentions, it goes the wrong direction. It's a roller coaster ride, Doug, and I'm happy to be on it.
Happy to be on it with you, buddy. I'm excited for the game on Friday too. Like I'm excited for just to go back to the beginning. Excited to have TJ Warren back in the building. Hope he crushes it.
I'm happy to speak again.
All right. We're going to get out of here. Make sure you tune in and subscribe to YouTube, where we are broadcasting just about after every game during the week and not so much on the weekends. But make sure you are joining the group that is getting us toward 4,000 subscribers over on YouTube. Super free. It's the best way to help the show. Subscribe to Locked On Nets over on YouTube.
All I have in this world are my balls and my word, and I don't break them for anybody. That's Tony Montana.
One of the all-time great poets. We will be back again next week talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.